The BBC Production Music Orchestral Toolkit, Cue Placement and Creative Tips. On this video I'm going to show you how to place the cues in the Orchestral Toolkit so that they join seamlessly, and I'm also going to show you some creative tips. I'm using Final Cut Pro, but the same method will work in any multi-track editor. Firstly, set your project to 48K and make sure your computer sound card driver can read files at this sample rate, otherwise the toolkit may play back at the wrong speed and pitch, and the placement system won't work. Next, make sure you have several stereo audio tracks available, a minimum of 2 but ideally 4. OK, let's go to Finder and look for a first cue. As you probably know, pressing the spacebar in Finder will instantly preview a selected file. Once you have chosen a cue you like, drag it onto the first audio track in your editor. The toolkit is in AIFF format, meaning the audio files will play immediately in most editors without the need for conversion or rendering. Now go back to Finder and look for your next cue. I'm looking at the labelling in the file titles to identify which cues are likely to work well together. Here I've selected one from another track but with similar characteristics, as shown by the major or minor key indicator, the size chevrons, the pace brackets and the feel. Drag it onto the timeline, dropping it near the end of the first cue. Obtaining seamless transitions between cues is simply a matter of overlapping them by exactly 3 seconds. If possible, use keystroke commands to do this. Which ones will depend on your particular editor, and if you have a snap or magnetic cursor option, this helps greatly. In Final Cut, I'm actually typing in my 3-second rewinds, but in other programs I tend to nudge my cursor about in 1-second increments using the arrow keys. So, place your cursor at the end of the first cue. Rewind 3 seconds and drag your second cue to this point. It's as simple as that. If I think that the cues work well together but the transition isn't quite smooth enough, I can place a percussive swell over the join. Going to the percussive swells folder, I select a suitable cue. In this case, I'll try a medium cymbal swell. The placement procedure is similar, but with swells and hits you rewind 3 seconds back from your desired climax or hit point, in this case the beginning of the second cue. So let's drag the swell to approximately the right position on the timeline. Now, using the keyboard commands, I place the cursor at the beginning of the second cue, rewind 3 seconds, and that's my drop point. Move the swell cue to the cursor position and have a listen to the transition now. With the next cue we look for, let's try creating a more dramatic change. In the Action and Adventure folder, I'm going to pick out an aggressive cue. Drag it onto the timeline, locate to the end of the previous cue, back time 3 seconds, and place the new one. If it's a bit severe, or if you want to announce the change, drag in a swell from Finder. In this case, let's go for a timpani roll. Drag it onto the timeline, place your cursor at the point you want the transition to climax, rewind 3 seconds, and move your timpani swell to this position. As you can hear, all the thematic cues that we've selected so far have had suspended ends. In other words, no resolving note. If they did, they wouldn't be able to loop or segue. However, you may well want a particular cue to resolve, and you can easily do this by tagging on its end cue, as indicated by the E number at the end of its title. You'll find this in the Endings subfolder for each track. Drag it into the timeline and use the 3-second rule to place it. Let's have a listen to the result. There's one exception to the 3-second rule, and that is for the 100 or so cues that have BT6 at the end of their title. This simply stands for back time 6 seconds. The reason for this extra 3-second back timing is that these cues have leading notes or swells that occur before the first beat of the bar. And because these leading notes or swells don't account for the whole of the additional 3 seconds at the beginning, these files also have a portion of silence before you hear the first note. We'll preview one so you can see what I mean. The green flash indicates the first beat of the bar. The tracks in the toolkit cover a vast dynamic range, so we felt it would be unwise to normalise every cue. We've left cues at their natural volume. This principle should ensure that most cues are approximately the correct volume relative to others. However, inevitably some adjustment of levels may be necessary. So, we've seen how to join the cues sequentially, but the toolkit also has hundreds of cues that can run side by side. Let's have a look at this. Go to Finder and pick a sustain from folder B. We'll start by using one in the key of E. As we showed in the labelling video, all of the cues with a bracketed minus sign in the title are in E minor, and will sit well over sustains in E. Most of the cues with a bracketed plus sign in the title are in G major, so would naturally go with G sustains. Musically, that's all you need to know to get the most out of using sustains. E for the cues with a minus sign and G for the ones with a plus sign. We have also included sustains in all the other keys so that you can experiment with different creative effects, or if desired, produce your own musical progressions. Now drag the sustain into the timeline, and I'm going to loop it using the 3-second rule. For this demonstration, I'm also going to drag in a sustain in another key, and when laid over the one in E, you'll hear the different dramatic effect. If you need to shorten sustains, always trim them from the front and fade them in slightly. This way you will preserve the natural reverb tail at the end. If you want to lengthen them, just loop them as I did a moment ago. Now I'm going to go to the Unique Motifs folder. Many of the motifs are presented with different orchestrations, full orchestra, strings, woodwind, brass, etc., enabling you to reprise them but without the repeats sounding one-dimensional. OK, select a few of them and drag them into your project, placing them roughly where you want them. And now let's have a listen. If your software allows, it's quite fun to add them, take them away and move them, etc. on the fly. Hear how the mood changes when the different sustain comes in. Sustains also work really well underneath looped rhythm cues. So let's go to the Action and Adventure folder and pick one. Drag it onto the timeline and loop it, again using the 3-second rule. Now I can start to build up a collage of sounds by adding motifs, sustains, rhythms, hits and swells. Whilst this video demonstrates the fundamental techniques involved in using the toolkit, it has only scratched the surface of what is creatively possible. As well as using it as we've shown, we would urge you to experiment and have fun. With a bit of trial and error, you will often get some wonderful sonic surprises.